Tasks from Scratch UI. Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to explain how to create with Voltapp a very simple example of tasks. This example will be synchronized with an Airtable database. And as you can see, this is what our example is going to look like. We will have items which we will check to validate, delete, and add new items. So, to start off, I'll show you what the Airtable database looks like. You can see the new item that I just added here, as well as all of the other items. And you can see that it updates directly in the database. And one last point, you can also see that when we are in preview mode, they are not the same items as in the database. This is because in the example, we added a default variable with values for each item. If I go and look at my variables, I have a task variable in which I have 3 different items with different messages. For example, finish project, which you can see here. So this is the final example that works completely, but we'll just start from scratch and create a new Voltapp project in order to recreate this example entirely. And we're going to call this New Tasks. So the first step will be to do the overall design. That is to say, we're going to add a title that will place with an auto margin on the right, which will push it to the edge. I'm going to put a top margin of 30 pixels and also the surrounding section. And I'm going to put an internal margin of 20 pixels. And finally, since it's a title, we're going to change its font. So, as you can see here, it's linked to the theme.text variable. There's a theme.text and a theme.text bold, and the advantage is that we have our global variables to define these things that can be changed everywhere at once. Otherwise, we can go for a font manually if we want to use a particular font. And lastly, I'm going to change the size of it to a larger size. And then here, I'm going to have a list. So I'm going to go into my nodes and look for a list node that I'm going to add like this. And so I have my list. Here, we can also align all of the items. The thing is that the list will not manage a section, so it will take into account the parameters of the parent section, which are generally centered in the section. If I align them to the left, it should do it. But inside each item, the text is centered. So you also have to say that in each item, you want to align the content to the left. For the moment, there is only a text, but later we will add a checkbox as well. If I go to my nodes, I can see here that I have a checkbox node that I can add very easily like this in my section. I don't want my item to be vertically aligned, but horizontally aligned to the left. So it's starting to look more and more like a to-do list. Finally, one last thing I want to add is the input and the button to be able to create items. Before that, I'm just going to add a bit more spacing quickly. Then I'm going to add a new section after my list that I'll call footer. You can see that it takes up all of the space that's left. It's not necessarily what I want. So I'm going to go in and set a height of, just for example, 60 pixels. And then I'm going to set my top to auto, which will push and allow my section to be at the bottom. To finish things off, I'm going to add a button here, as well as input, and I'm going to align my section like this. Put the input here, and then I'll put add. And so that's it. We have our entire UI creating tasks. And if I start here, we can see that we can check off tasks. In the meantime, if I try to add an item, nothing will be added. But we still have more or less the visual of a task management applications. You'll have to tune in more to see how to exactly add tasks. And that's all for today. In the next tutorial, we'll see how to use variables to make this data dynamic. Tasks from scratch. Set up Airtable. Hello again, everyone. This time, we'll see how to set up Airtable for the task project. The first thing to do is to go into Airtable and to log in or to create an account if you don't already have one. Then we will arrive on this interface. We're going to add a new database that we will call New Tasks and choose an icon for it. Then we will arrive on a grid view, which is the basic view of Airtable. In this view, we will create a column that we need. We'll have a message column that has a text. And we don't need this one, so we'll replace it by renaming the type. We'll put a checkbox type to know if the task is completed or not. This field can be deleted. And this one will have to make a record_ID formula. And we'll also rename the field name to ID. So why did I do that? Because ID will allow us to recover a unique identifier that represents each message. So if we want to modify it, for example, by changing whether it's completed or not, or if we want to delete it, we're going to use the ID of the line so we know exactly which element we want to delete or not. So here we can put in the text, for example, a shopping list. Toilet paper, bananas, eggs. And you can see here that I've already taken the toilet paper, but not the bananas or the eggs yet. So now we have our database ready. We just have to use it in our project. So we'll rename this table beforehand, which will be called tasks. Then the last thing that remains to be done to be able to configure an Airtable project is to go into our account. And as you can see here, we have an API key. The idea is to just copy the API key and then put it into the Airtable node. So we're just going to take an Airtable node like this, put all of our project underneath so that all of the variables in this project are accessible. And we'll put our API here. We'll select our database, which is called New Tasks, and select our table, which is called Tasks. And once we've done that, we'll be able to use Airtable queries in the graph to retrieve data. So we're going to create a graph, and don't forget to do that. We'll have to switch over to graph mode because right now we're in the editor mode. From the graph mode, we'll be able to add a block. So we will take an event block, which are the entry points from which we can start a graph. We'll add an appear event, which refers to when the app opens at the beginning when it gets started. We will call an action, and then we can see that there are actions that have been declared. This is thanks to Airtable, which has declared these actions. We have actions such as retrieve records, list records, delete records, and more. This will allow us to manipulate the Airtable database. We'll start with taking a look at list records to retrieve data from Airtable, from the table we've just created. We'll be able to create a variable from records by doing promote to variable in order to have a variable that we can use in our code. If we also want to manage errors, we can state a condition, if true. So if the request was successful, we create the record value. Otherwise, we can create a new variable by going here and creating a variable that we will call error message of type text and import it. So if it's wrong, we will link this error message with the Airtable error. So now we have two different cases. We've either created a record variable, in which case the request worked, and in which case the request didn't work. And we've created an error message variable. Then we'll have to use this variable in our code. So when we create variables, they are present on a given node. And in this case, if I go into my variables, I see that the records variable is created on new task. That means at the root of the project. So it means that it will be accessible to all of the children of the project. The error message variable I created on the Airtable node won't exist if I go into new tasks, for example. So I'll rename it to tasks to make it clearer. Then in my list, I want to be able to associate them with a variable rather than having hard values. That is to say, values that are declared in the list like that. I'm going to take the task variable and associate it here. So for the moment, we can see that it tells me that the list is empty, and that's okay. I'll explain why in a minute. And then in item, what I'm going to do is I'm going to associate the text with the item in my list. You can see that there are variables that have been declared. There is an index variable that's declared by the list that I have associated in list, and an item variable that contains different fields, an ID field, a message field, and several other fields. These are both texts. If I take the message field, it means that in my list, in the case that they're items, it will be associated to the message field. And for the moment, there's nothing displayed because we are not in play mode, which means that the Airtable request has not been executed. And if I do click play, you can see that now we are getting our data from Airtable. And lastly, testing can be a little bit annoying if we don't have any default values. So we can go into the code of our task variable and set default values ourselves. For example, we can put 1, 2, anything you would like. Now I have 2 default variables, and we can see that my task variable is not empty anymore. But if I press play, it will retrieve the data from Airtable. And so when I'm offline, we still have default values, which allows us to test the project very quickly. And that's all for today. Don't forget to practice some of these new techniques and tools that you've learned at home, and I'll see you at the next video. Tasks from scratch. Add an item. Hi everyone, let's start with a quick recap of the previous task example. So for now, we've done the design of an app, and we've added Airtable, as well as a graph that allows you to load items from Airtable. And we've also got default values in the variable, so that when you're not in play mode and you're not making the Airtable request, you still have items. So that's what we have for now. Now we're going to do the code in order to add a new item. To do this, we're going to go to Input here, and as you can see, there's already a graph created by default. And what exactly does this graph do? Well, when there is a change event, what it does is set the value. So what it does is that it will say each time we type in the input, we will update the value, which is a variable. And if I test this here, this is what makes it so that when I type something, the input will fill up. And if I go here and disconnect this and hit play again, we see that when I type, nothing happens. So what's happened is that this variable is declared on an input. And what I explained to you in the previous tutorials is that when you create a variable, it is available in the current node and all of the subnodes that are inside of it. And so the problem is that I'm going to need it in another node other than the input node. So for this, I'm going to take my value variable. So I'm going to put it on footer, for example, because I need it here too. Now, if I go to footer, I can see that the value variable is no longer on the input directly, but on the footer. So we'll rename it and call it new task. We are not going to set a default value for it because by default, we want it to be empty. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a graph on my button. I'm going to add a click block so that when I click on the button, I create a new task from the new task variable. For this, I'm going to introduce a new concept because I could directly create a record in Airtable, But instead of doing that, I'm going to update that variable, in addition to creating the record, and I'd like all of my graph logic to be in the same place. That is to say, in the Airtable node, so that I'll be able to find my way around a little easier. So I'm going to use a new concept called custom events. Up until now, we've seen how to use a lot of the basic events, like click, appear, and lots of other ones. But for this, we're going to need to use a custom event. So to get started, I'm going to go into my Airtable graph, and I'm going to add a new block, an event, and call it add item. It's a parameter item. That is to say, a text that I will call message, so the message of the task. And that's all, because by default, the rest will be created automatically. And once I have that, it's all set. I have my custom event created. So now I'll be able to use it, but I'm going to come back to that later. I'm also going to have to call it. So here in my button, when I click, I'm going to say add item. And once I add my item, I'm going to do a second action. I'm going to take my new task variable, and I'm going to set it to an empty text because generally when we click on the add button, we don't want the text to stay inside, but we want the input to be empty. Finally, one last point is that I'm going to attach my new task variable to my message. Our event now has a name, and now we just need it to say what we want to do when this event is called. So in the Airtable node for now, I'm going to call the debug function. We're going to change its color to green, and we're going to display our message. So when I call the event in the button subnode, it's going to call that event on the Airtable node, and then I'm going to be able to put all of my logic of what I want to do when I add an item. Right now I'm clicking play, and when I go there and I start typing my item, you can see that in my debug, I'm going to have chocolate displayed. The same as if I type something else. And that's a good sign. Now what I want to do is to be able to add a new item. I'm going to do it in 2 steps. The first step is to modify my variable. And I'll explain in a minute why this is so important. We also don't need the debug because now we know that it's working. Here, I want to modify my new task variable by adding a new item. And to do this, we're going to have expressions in the block that will allow us to modify values. I have an expression called add to list that allows you to add an item to a list. What I'm going to do is select my tasks list and the item I'm going to structure. And I'll link message to message. The default setting for completed is false, so we'll leave it like that, and same for ID. So I'm going to then take the result of this list and associate it with the task, and it will add a new item to my list when I receive the add item event. Finally, I also want to update the database by doing create record, which will take as a parameter an object. So here I do the same for the list, and I'll associate a message here. So here what's going to happen is when I click on the button, it calls add item with this new message. And it goes into Airtable and it calls upon this piece of code here. Then it will do the set tasks, which will update the tasks variable by adding an item in it. And finally, it will update the records in Airtable. And if everything goes well, it should work. So if I click play, my app starts, and if I add chocolate item, it is added. And if I go into Airtable in my example new task, I can see that chocolate has been added. And so we know that the entire process has worked correctly. Thanks for joining on this video. Don't forget to see out more of our videos to see even more features of Voltapp. Tasks from scratch. Update an item. Hello, in this video, we're going to see exactly how to update an item. So we'll start by taking our tasks example. So far, we have loaded the item from Airtable. We've also managed the addition of items. But if I update the item by clicking the box, we can see that the item is not updated in the completed column. So what we're going to do is go to the checkbox, which currently updates the variable value, a variable declared on checkbox, when the checkbox changes. If, for example, we remove this, and instead I decide to go to the checkbox and say that value is disconnected, and instead I connect the completed variable of the item, just a quick reminder that each time we create a list, there is a variable that is automatically declared for each of these items in the list to know how to display it. So I take the completed and I assign it to value. Now if I click play, I see that our item is checked in the database. However, if I go to the list and try to check an item myself, we see that it doesn't work, and it's because we haven't managed the update. For this, we'll have to implement the update according to the change event. And to do this, we'll use the same logic as we did for add an item. So we'll create a new event, which we'll call update item. It will have 4 parameters. The first is a text called message, a second for completed, which corresponds to our field in the Airtable database. The third will be the ID, which is also a text. And the last one will be index, so a number that will allow the list to be updated. This is because when we want to update data in Airtable, we use an ID. But when we want to change a specific element in a list, it's the index that we use to know which element to change. And that is the position of the element in the list. So now we have our element. We'll simply add it to the graph and code its logic. It's very simple to what we had on add item. The first step was the task variable. The second step is to do update a record in Airtable. We will have to recover the item, deconstruct it using structure and object to recover the different fields of the item. And as we can see, we need the message and the completed field. And the Airtable needs the ID to know which item it will have to update. So now we can link our fields. And that's it for the Airtable part. Now for the variable lists part, we're going to use an edit item from list function, which will allow us to edit an item in the list at a given index. We're going to specify which list we're working on, because if we use the return for the moment, it's a text list, as you can see here, but we want to use our task list, which is an object. So now we have our list of objects, and each item corresponds to a completed message and an ID. Now there are 2 parts left to cover in this edit item from lists block. The index we're going to get from update item. And for the item, we're going to structure an object. We're going to take the message, completed, and the ID. This means that when we call update item, we'll update the task variable by editing the item with the new values. And then we'll make an update record. Now that we've made the update item event, we just have to call it. So we'll go to the checkbox and we'll do update item. Where we'll change the value to completed. And then for the message, we'll link the item.message for ID, item.id, and for index, we'll link index. So now if I click play and check hello, we see that hello is updated. And conversely, if I uncheck these, they've also been updated. And so that's it. Thanks for joining us on this video. Don't forget to check out our other videos for more tools and tricks. Tasks from scratch. Delete a task. Now that we've seen how to update an item, we will see now how to delete it. And once again, it's going to be the same logic. So as you can see in preview mode, the list is empty because the task object is empty. So if I go into task directly in the variables here, I can see that there is nothing in the default value. If I want to be able to test them easily, I can add default values. For example, I'll put item 1 and item 2, which I'll identify as completed. Now if I go back into the project, we can see that by default, if I click on the list, we have item 1 and item 2. And if I go to empty state, we see that it is still empty. I can modify the message that I want. I can put in a margin. I can really have more manipulation if I want. We're going to take a look at the item a little more closely. So far, we just have our items in a row. We'll maybe add a section around it just to clean it up and make it look a little nicer. To do that, we're going to put our item in our section that we're going to align at the top. And finally, in the item, we're going to add an icon that will allow us, when we click on it, to delete the task. To do this, it's very simple. We'll go into the nodes, we'll choose icon. We'll add it here and choose an icon from our icon library. If we want to shift the cross to the right, we can go directly to it and put an auto margin on the left. Here, we'll use the same logic as for checkbox. We'll tell the graph to declare a new click event and we'll say that when we click the icon here, we'll call the delete item event. And for this, it's the same as earlier. We'll create a custom delete item event. To delete an item from the list, we'll need an index. And to delete it on Airtable, we'll need the ID. So here we'll have just two parameters. One that we'll call ID, and one that will be a number that we'll call index. So here we have our event that we can add to the graph. We'll update the task variable using setTasks, and then we'll put an Airtable action, delete record, which will take the ID. To modify the task variable, we will use the expression remove item from list. And as before, we'll assign the list task to it. And here we'll give the index. First, we need to go to the icon and say that we're going to assign delete item with item.id as the ID and index as the index. Normally now, if I click play and delete an item, for example, let's get rid of eggs. Eggs is no longer in the list, and so it has worked correctly. And that's it for the deleting an item part. Don't forget to join us for the next video for even more things to do with tasks. Tasks from scratch. Edit an item. I'm going to show you in this next part of tutorials how to actually edit an item. So actually, we're going to have the same logic for add, so we'll have to go to checkbox, which had a set value that allowed us to update an item, which in turn updated the visual with the V when we clicked on it. Now, if I remove it, you can see that if I hit play again, it doesn't work anymore, which makes sense. For now, though, rather than just doing change a variable, what we're going to do is change the task variable and also change the Airtable database with an Airtable action. So what we're going to do is create a new custom event in Airtable. And so we're going to create an update item event. And on Airtable, we're going to try to put the same field names. So message, completed, and ID. Thanks so much for watching these series of videos about creating tasks from scratch, how to do to-do lists with no code.